Hey, my computer's back. Well, not really, it's kind of a new computer, mostly. But I'm back with an actual functional computer. Bring it on, Joe.
I recall that there was an incident of a professor.
Oh boy, another big professor story. So just to establish the scenario here, is this going to be Kent Hovind's professor of fish feeding, or will it be a different suspiciously convenient character?
Who insisted to his students, there's no God. He kept saying, there's no God, there's no God.
Okay. Well, I'd say you might be ripping this straight out of the movie God's Not Dead, but I'm pretty sure your video's from before that movie came out. But don't tell anyone, I don't want my audience knowing that I'm debunking old videos again. So more likely, it's just one of those ridiculous 90s email forwards. You remember those? Like some random loser that you emailed once 6 months ago spams Christian propaganda to everyone they've ever communicated with via email? I don't know, maybe half of you aren't even old enough to have experienced the wonders of the 1990s internet. But I do know there's a lot of elderly fuckers like me watching. Anyway, one email in particular springs to mind. I would show it here, but 20 years ago I hadn't exactly planned on using it in a YouTube video, so I didn't keep it. But I found copies of a few different versions and linked them in the description, so if you really want to spoil the whole video for yourself, just go read those. I wouldn't really recommend it, but some people hate surprises apparently.
When they said, why? Because most of them, they believe. Some were Jewish, some were Christian, some were Muslims. He said, if I don't see it, if I don't hear it, if I can't feel it, if I can't taste it, if I can't smell it, it doesn't exist. And if it doesn't exist, I don't believe in it. It's as simple as that.
Professor of fish feeding confirmed. If he's a professor of anything else, he's an incompetent oaf. You know, I'm genuinely curious how many religious people actually believe this is a common mindset among atheists. I mean, surely most of you don't buy into such convenient, absurd statements that are obviously designed for nothing but for theists to mentally jerk off other theists. I've always figured most of you must at least be smarter than that. I mean, the tiniest bit of observation would inform you that most atheists believe in plenty of things that they can't directly sense. The sphericality of the Earth, black holes, global warming, the dark side of the moon, the Big Bang, the physical presence and shape and size of their own brain. Pick your own, I'm sure you can come up with thousands of ideas. A great example is evolution, because if anything, the struggles between atheists and creationists should show you that atheists are in some cases more likely than at least some types of religious people to believe things that are inaccessible through direct sensory perception. You know, think of Ken Ham's distinction between historical evidence and observational evidence. What he means by that is if it can't be directly seen, heard, felt, tasted, and smelled, he doesn't believe it. So he denies evolution for exactly the same small-minded reason that the professor in your example supposedly denies God. Evolution is not immediately accessible to the senses. It's not something that you can just casually look around and see happening right before your eyes. Sure, you can see the evidence for evolution all over the place, but you can't see evolution itself. You interpret the evidence and infer evolution from it. And so to Ken, because evolution is not immediately accessible to the senses, you can't just stand in the middle of a field chewing your cud and casually look around and see evolution happening right before your eyes. Then he thinks it's idiotic to believe it. Obviously, it's a ridiculous sentiment. If the world worked like that, we could hardly ever learn anything. And so most people in the atheist community vehemently disagree with it, because as you and I understand, it's far too simplistic a lens through which to view the world. It entirely ignores the role of reasoning and logic in reaching conclusions. You know, the reasoning and logic who you, Joe, make it your mission to shit on, while simultaneously trying to use them to give your ideas some kind of credibility, as we're about to see in this video. And although I expect religious people to have the intelligence to figure out that atheists generally don't think this way, regardless of whether I can see, hear, feel, taste, or smell their intelligence, this argument gets brought up so often to me that I've got to start to wonder. I mean, however ludicrous it might sound to me, obviously it sounds rock solid to considerably more than 0 people. But having never been religious, I can only judge the prevalence of it from the outside. So, to anyone out there who was or is religious, were you ever actually convinced that this is how atheists are? Was this idea common in your religious community?
One of the students tried to argue with him about it. He was saying, well, God is something beyond that. You have to have faith. You have to believe. And he said, why? Why should I believe? How? The boy said, well, I don't know, but we just have to believe. He said, sit down. Another boy stood up and he said, listen, as Muslims, you know, we believe, but we have proof at the same time.
You know, Joe, you and I don't agree on much, but that's one thing I agree with you on. As you said in I think it was my first response to you. When you were a Christian, you had this feeling that you had to take God's existence purely on faith with no reasons. And yeah, that might have been how you were. It's not really true of educated Christians, obviously. They have plenty of reasons, even if I think they're terrible ones. They might see faith alone as sufficient in theory, but in practice, they still look for reasons. But absolutely, a lot of Christians don't bother to do that. And you say that when you became a Muslim, you realized the value of having reasons to back up your belief in God. And obviously, there's plenty of Muslims who don't do that too, but you say that that's what happened to you. And it seems that's why you added this student into your story, to provide the contrast between the persuasive power of a believer who can present reasons and one who can't. Now, I think it's great that you came to the realization that it's valuable to back up your beliefs with actual reasons instead of just believing what you heard without thinking about it. That would reflect quite well on you. But unfortunately, the video we're currently in the middle of has you accepting purely on the basis of what you heard that Europeans thought the Earth was flat until 500 years ago, that the idea of a spherical Earth was put forward in the Quran before the Europeans thought of it, that scientists used to think bees couldn't fly according to physics, not to mention this contrived email forward about a student poning his retarded caricature of an atheist professor. If you believe all of this absolute trash just because you heard it somewhere, I have very little confidence in your ability to reliably assess your beliefs through reason. And by the way, if in just a few minutes of talking you've already exposed that you believe this many obvious popular myths, how many more must be rattling around in that head of yours? Your brain must be a garbage dump.
He said, proof? What proof do you have? He said, by knowing what God has done and what he's doing, we know he exists. He said, what? What are you talking about? He said, sir, can you see electricity?
And then he was like, duh, yeah. And then he was all like, really? And he was like, word. And he was like, you be tripping. And then he was like, no, you be tripping. And then he was like,
well, no, but it still exists.
Sorry, I got a little distracted by all the he's. Can you say that again?
He said, sir, can you see electricity? Well, no, but it still exists.
Oh, so I didn't mishear you. I had to make sure because I couldn't accept you actually said that without confirmation. So, this professor's never seen a Tesla coil? Or lightning? He's never seen a spark when he plugged something in? Well, I mean, I know he's only a lowly fish-feeding professor, but I expected better than that at least. Look, Joe, if you can't come up with good examples on your own, just read the email forward verbatim and stop trying to use your own brain, alright? Clearly there's something wrong with it.
Ah, true.
I know.
Sir, he said, are you able to hear everything? He said, yes.
So you expect me to believe that this professor actually believes that he can hear everything, as if he's never been unable to hear something someone said to him in his entire life. Man, the electricity part was bad, but with this you really jumped the shark, dude. If anyone in your audience is still nodding along with you at this point, thinking this all sounds plausible and not like a total crock of shit, well, all I can say is you deserve each other.
He said, wait a minute. Aren't there sounds that some animals hear that we can't hear?
Oh man, he's got him there. Wowza, what a brilliant student. I can't wait to find out if the professor recognizes this mundane fact. I'm on the edge of my, feet.
Well, yes.
Oh wow, maybe I was wrong. This professor's clearly too smart for fish feeding. No, maybe this is his colleague, the professor of cat feeding.
Okay, now there's two things. One you can't see, one you can't hear, but you still believe in it, don't you?
True. Well, not true for the first one, but the second one's true. So there are sounds we can't hear, but which can be easily detected by instruments and can be used in technology, so what's the argument then? That God is similar to high-frequency sound and that he's inaccessible to our raw senses, but we can create a device to detect them? Sounds kind of stupid to me, but that has to be the argument, or else this entire part of your argument is completely irrelevant, since it in no way applies to the question of God's existence. So unless you're just spewing out irrelevancies to waste everyone's time, your implication must be that we can build a God detector. Now, I don't expect us to be able to, but if your own argument becomes utterly pointless unless we can, I'm gonna ask you how we can. So how can we?
Well, yeah, but I have evidence. I have scientific evidence. Okay.
Better move on quick before the meaning of that point sinks in with your audience. The meaning being, maybe mean old atheist professor guy here doesn't actually form his worldview just by staring around dumbly like a cow.
Now I ask you another thing.
Who said you could ask me another thing, insolent student? You didn't say, sir, can I ask you another thing, sir?
Sir, is there such a thing as heat? He said, of course. Everybody knows there's heat. And we measure it as BTUs, British thermal units.
But sir, you can't see heat. So why not believe in God?
He said, sir, is there such a thing as cold? He said, yes, there's such a thing as cold. He said, sir, there's not such a thing as cold. There is no cold. What? What are you talking about?
God damn, this professor sucks so hard. Anyone who paid for this course should ask for their money back, seriously. Anyway, this seems like as good a time as any to mention the fact that in this video, you're not content to just ramble your way through this old chestnut once. No, right now, you're gonna go to break, and when you come back, you're gonna tell the entire goddamn story up to this point all over again. Man, I know my weaknesses, I know I can be repetitive sometimes, but I wish I could get away with this level of copy-pasted bullshit. And no, audience, I'm not going to put you through the same story a second time around. You get the point already. I got better things to do with my time.
I'm sure you'd like to know the answer to that too. So when we come back from the break, let's find out what the student meant when he said there's no such thing as cold, and then find out how that relates to the rationale of the human and how we can prove there's God.
That's great, Joe, except this video is not about how to prove there's a God, it's about the meaning of life. Remember, you kept saying so? Why are we here? What is our purpose? I guess it's just too much to ask for the host of the show to keep the point of his own show in mind for half the show. I should remember not to have such unreasonable expectations of this kind of show. But okay, Joe, fine. Forget that meaning of life stuff. That's old, that's boring. Yeah, let's go on to something fresh and new that we've never done before. How to prove there's a God. Awesome.
When we went to the break, I was telling you a story about a professor and some of his students. The students are believers, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, but the professor is the atheist. He doesn't believe anything.
He doesn't believe in anything? But you just finished saying he believes in electricity, sound, heat, cold, the usefulness of science.
And he keeps talking about his rational mind, his logic, his common sense, and he's insisting that there's no God based on all of this.
Sure, yep, and he believes in his rational mind, his logic, his common sense, the non-existence of God. In fact, it sounds like he believes a whole bunch of stuff, just not your stuff, which is not quite the same thing now, is it? Anyway, now we're going to skip your complete retelling of the entire story and pick up after the student said there's no such thing as cold.
That's when the professor started to get really crazy. He said, are you nuts? Of course there's cold. Don't you know what it is to be cold? You go outside and it's cold outside and you... He said, sir, that's a concept that we have of our feelings, of our skin temperature. But in fact, there's no such thing as cold. There is only the existence of heat. Because there's an absolute for cold 452 degrees Kelvin. And below that, there isn't anything colder.
Wow, okay. Where to start? I guess with the obvious, 450 degrees Kelvin is absolute zero, is it? 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 177 Celsius? Man, and here I was thinking global warming was a problem, but it turns out we haven't even broken above absolute zero in eons. We could really use some of that global warming. Okay, I know you didn't mean that. You probably just heard absolute zero is about minus 460 Fahrenheit, and that's 0 Kelvin, and somehow you mixed the two up. And dropped the negative sign. And got the number wrong by like 10. But at least you got the point there's an absolute zero temperature. But that's not why cold can be said not to exist. No. Cold as the opposite of heat can be said not to exist because heat is the amount of energy transferred from a warmer system to a cooler one, and there isn't some alternative property that exists to describe cold. There's either more heat transfer or less or none, but there's no cold transfer because that would require defining cold in terms of something other than energy transfer, and that makes no sense. Funny thing though, you remember your stupid little gotcha attempt with Socrates in the last part? You know, Socrates believed in God and he's the inventor of logic, so logic itself says God exists. As if you think Socrates is logic incarnate. Silly Muslim, everyone knows Jesus is logic incarnate.
The Christian view, understood at the what I think is the most intellectual level, is that Jesus is the divine logos. The logos is things like logic, mathematics, geometry, and ideas. All that stuff that makes the universe run the way it does, is actually intelligent and decided to become a person, and decided he needed a mother and he needed to be conceived, born, and died.
Or maybe Socrates is Jesus. Yes, the pieces are falling into place. So I don't need to say anything about that clip, do I? Nah, I didn't think so. Anyway, Joe, you acted like Socrates' logic must be perfect because, according to you, he invented logic, and so his beliefs must be perfect too. And yet here's you saying cold doesn't exist when logic itself says it does. So what are you gonna say now? But all that aside, it kinda sounds like your fake professor just misunderstood the question and thought the student was referring to the sensation of cold, which is real. Maybe the student could have just clarified instead of being a complete dick about it? It'd only be polite, right?
From that, we add to it and go up degree by degree by degree until you get as hot as you want to go. And you can have heat, mega heat, and it can go on and on. But there's no such thing as cold. Heat or the absence of heat.
Actually, Joe, you're thinking of temperature. Temperature, not heat, is measured in degrees, and absolute zero is a measure of temperature, not heat. Heat is transferred energy, and it's measured in calories or joules, not degrees. Now, normally I wouldn't bother to make such a pedantic distinction because who cares? But if you're going to be a pedantic dickhead, then so am I.
Professor didn't say a word.
Probably for the best. He doesn't seem to have much useful to say at the best of times. Just a string of childish tantrums born of misunderstandings. I guess because it's you putting the words in his mouth.
When the student said, "Sir, is there such a thing as light?" He said, "Are you crazy? Of course there's light. Look around you. How do you see me right now if you don't know about light?"
Seriously, you're still not going to let him get to the point that's currently bludgeoning him in the face so he can move the conversation forward? You're just going to keep on acting out his tantrums every time the kid talks? I gotta say, that's pretty insulting to your audience's intelligence. Although I will admit it's probably well suited to their level.
He said, "You're right, sir. There is light. Is there such a thing as darkness?" He said, "Where are you going with this? Why are you wasting my time?"
Huh, alright. At least now he's demanded the student get to the fucking point so the story can move along.
"Of course there's darkness." He said, "No, there's not." "What? If you turn off all the lights and the sun's not up, you're going to be in the dark, yes or no?"
Oh, never mind. Prepare for the long-winded explanation of what everyone watching already figured out. You know, Joe, your story would be a little bit more impressive if at least you had the professor understand the point and make it for the student instead of acting like a completely oblivious moron, now that the principle of what the student's saying has been laid out so incredibly plainly. I mean, you can still make him a snappy douche, I know you need that for narrative purposes, but at least make him a slightly smarter one. You know, something like, yes, you idiot, I get it, darkness is only the absence of light, you piece of shit. You already made the same point when you said cold is the absence of heat, you stupid bitch. Would you stop repeating yourself and get on with it, you total goober? Now, Joe, you might be confused about why I would suggest this. You might think that it would make the protagonist of your story sound less impressive, since he wouldn't be intellectually dominating his opponent quite so thoroughly and unrealistically. But ask yourself this. Were you ever impressed by watching a fully capable man beating up a child in a wheelchair? Just saying.
"Sir, there actually is no such thing as darkness. There is light, but when there is no light, we call it darkness." "What?"
Oh, wow, look at that face. Oh, the contempt is glorious. What? I have never heard of such an absurd concept. What is this woo-woo about darkness being the absence of light? You could tell me this character's from like a Bugs Bunny cartoon and I wouldn't know the difference.
"Sir, listen. You can bring light in all forms. You can have candlelight, light from a match, flashlight. You can have megawatts of light, big lights of all kinds. But when you have no light at all, you call it darkness, but in reality, it's still nothing more than what? Absence of light."
Okay, since you're just repeating yourself again, I have time for a quick tangent here. I absolutely adore the kind of simplistic preschool concepts you find profound. Like seriously, is this stuff even new to like first graders? Not where I'm from. And yet you spend so much time on this story, you put so much energy into it, that it's clear that you think your most likely adult audience needs this explained to them. Now I could think two things about this. It either reflects really poorly on you because it's incredibly condescending, or it reflects really badly on your audience, which also reflects badly on you because it means your show attracts mostly just the biggest idiots on the planet.
The professor says,
No shit, Sherlock. And you know how we found all that out? Science. So it's an argument for requiring scientific evidence for assertions about reality, and yet, for some reason, you think this functions as an argument against that. You didn't really think this through, did you?
Professor says, "Yes, but still I don't see your point."
Oh, right, of course. Never mind.
He said, "Okay, listen. You're saying because you don't see something, you don't hear it, you don't smell it, you don't taste it, you don't feel it, you don't imagine it, it doesn't exist."
Because you don't imagine it? Where's that coming from? So what, if you can imagine something, it does exist? Oh man, if that's true, we're all screwed. This unassuming little professor of cat feeding possesses the ultimate power to make real anything he can imagine.
He said, "That's right, and that's what I believe, and now I'm always going to believe that." I said, "Okay. Sir, has anybody ever seen your brain? Heard your brain? smelled your brain, tasted your brain, or felt your brain?
Hold on. The student said that to illustrate the previous point about darkness being the absence of light? But Joe, this point has nothing to do with the previous point. The heat and cold, light and dark points are about the problem of evil. You ignore the conclusion for some reason, making it a complete waste of time to even mention them, but what they're supposed to do is lead to the idea that evil is just the absence of God, in the same way darkness is the absence of light. That's the argument. On the other hand, this point about sensing the professor's brain, which you're trying to pass off like it's an explanation for the previous points, is just meant as a way to denigrate the scientific method, and more specifically the concepts of basing your beliefs on observable evidence and of evolution. And now, audience, if you're unfamiliar with these stories and you want to check out the links, this is the time I would recommend you do so, because now there's nothing to spoil. I'd recommend the version on Islamic Web, and if you do check them out, notice how the parts about heat and cold and light and dark serve a totally different purpose earlier in the story than the part about the brain. Joe, if you've actually seen this email personally and read it, you failed abysmally to understand it. You read it, you understood there was a point somewhere in there, but you didn't manage to figure out what that point was or how the examples were supposed to support it. And then after you failed completely to comprehend what you read, apparently you were too incompetent to even notice that you'd failed, and so you had the confidence to go on television and present the argument, which of course became a garbled mess when you tried to modify it because you didn't understand it. I actually wouldn't have minded debunking the original arguments because they're so incredibly lame they're funny, but there's no point right now because you didn't even manage to reach the unimpressive standard of incredibly lame. Compared to your version of the arguments, the originals sound like the epitome of rationality.
No, of course not. He said, then, sir, according to your own rules of testable evidence, you don't have a brain.
And everyone in the room stood up and applauded, and the professor blushed and ran out, and the next day he handed in his resignation, and the other students chipped in to buy the brave, brilliant, handsome Muslim student a gold medal and a bouquet. And that student's name was Albert Einstein. Well, I'm glad you're impressed with yourself. At least somebody is.
And this is what happens, you see, when a human being tries to take their logic too far.
No, this is what happens when a human being whose job it is to argue that logic is bad tries to take their logic anywhere at all.
Because, in fact, it's only Allah who has all knowledge. And Allah gives us from that knowledge, and He takes away from that knowledge. When you're born, you start out zero, and Allah begins to give you knowledge. And if you thought that you're the product of generations upon generations of people learning by trial and error, that's totally and completely incorrect. That would be like thinking that we have to reinvent the wheel every generation.
What? No. You'd have to reinvent the wheel every generation if your knowledge wasn't the product of previous generations, not if it was. You know that quote about how we're standing on the shoulders of giants? Yeah? Well, those giants include the people who invented the wheel, which is why we don't have to keep on inventing the wheel, you jackass.
We do learn from past mistakes. We do learn what's in front of us to take advantage of it. But just as we would not accept that you have to reinvent the wheel in every generation, you also don't have to reinvent thinking.
Right. And we don't, because we're the product of generations upon generations of people learning by trial and error, which doesn't need to be repeated. Man, this video was already a shit pudding, but this really puts the cherry on top.
Till next time, peace. Peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum.
Oh, get bent. But hold on now, we're missing something here. After you forgot your video was supposed to be about the purpose of life, you changed the subject to how to prove there's God. But then you didn't even try to address that. Not a hint of a shade of an attempt. No, at best, maybe we can say that you touched on why you shouldn't outright reject the possibility of God. You know, just for a second there at the end with the brain thing. Because the part about not sensing your brain is meant to argue that not everything requires observational evidence, and that's supposed to leave the door open for God. But that's a hell of a cry from how to prove there's God. Is it even possible to fail more miserably than this at producing an episode of television? Unbelievable. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching, and if you like my stuff, consider supporting me on Patreon, like the great people you're seeing on the screen right now. They're just the $5 and up people, but everyone who's donating through Patreon and PayPal are very, very much appreciated. By the way, subscribe, like the video, all that, and if you want early access, you can sign up to my email list at list.logicked.com. See you all next time.